Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. Lovely to see you again. It's been a week since we last spoke. And I want to thank you for numerous comments we got. The feedback from last week's show in particular was good. We were changing that show last week to the Phil Boswell show. So thanks for all your comments. And again, this week I'm joined by the famous two from Phil Boswell, the good old Coatbridge Cavalier, and the Paisley Mohawk himself over in Florida, the Floridian Paisleyite, Iain Lawson. Gentlemen, nice to see you as always. Always a pleasure and never a chore. How are we?
We're good.
Right. We're not jet lagged, I hope, Iain.
No, we're not. I'm recovering. I had a fall yesterday in a car park and sort of damaged my right side, but I'm back on my feet and I'm okay. So
see, that's what happens when you take too much drink in the cross-channel flight, the cross-Atlantic flight, mate.
If only.
But while you've been away, things have been going on. It's been quite a busy week again in politics, chaps, and we've got a lot to talk about. I suppose the first place to start really has got to be the Scottish budget. As usual, our budget is determined by whatever England decides is our pocket money for the year. And in fairness to the Scottish government, there's only so much they can do. I mean, we could be pedantic, I suppose, on here and say they could have done this differently and that differently. But at the end of the day, they very much are. Their hands are tied from the start, are they not, Phil? I'm going to get at you as the SNP man. Your hands are tied on the budget to a certain extent.
100%. It's designed that way specifically. There's always a diminishing cost. So what you do is it comes from Gers, it comes from Ian Lang, it comes from a system designed to make the devolved governments look bad. So what they do is they apportion the funds that you're always going to spend, the large chunks of it, on health and education, and say that you manage it. And we'll give you the budget, and it all comes from Westminster, of course. They decide how much you get. And in real terms, every single year it's diminishing, it's reducing. So, for example, this year it's 2.6% less than last year, the 22-23 figures. In real terms, when you take in inflation, it's less than the 21-22 by 2.6%. Now, what happens when incrementally you reduce your investment in anything? Especially with ongoing costs on the increase, you decrease the quality of whatever you're providing. So this is a deliberate way that Westminster, in health, it's through the Barnett formula. Obviously, they're privatising the health system in England. And through the Barnett formula, with every reduction in privatisation, it's another reduction in the 10% or percentage allowance through the Barnett formula that Scotland's apportioned. Tied in with an overall reduction in budget, where'd you get the money from? To compensate, you're just stealing from Peter to pay Paul. So I don't envy any devolved government in this system, particularly with the Tories. It's designed to make these governments look bad, and it's designed to encourage privatisation. Let's not pretend that's what it's for. It's exactly what it's about. They'll say, look, we've given these people the power. They can't manage it. They keep making these cuts. They can't make the books balance. Therefore, let's hand over to the private sector on all our chums. And look what happened to PPE. That's all you need to do. Look at Big Pharma's record. These people cannot be trusted and should not be trusted with our health service.
I mean, Iain, Phil touches on their PPE. For a start, the local authorities, in fairness to them, they're quite rightly saying, well, we don't have enough money. These cuts are too great. We need more money. And I think we all accept that. But there's never going to be enough money. Even when we're independent, people will still be saying, well, we need more money. But there is a fair shout. A huge amount of the local authorities' money is already ring-fenced that they have to spend on certain items, but also these huge PPE payments they've got to make for the next God knows how many decades takes away another load of the budget.
Thank you,
yes,
Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon Brown.
I totally accept everything that Phil said there. I mean, that's precisely the way it's organised, and it is gearing up to make privatisation much more likely, particularly in health. But, you know, for all that Phil said and the problems were identified, I looked at the budget just so I was up to speed for the programme today. And I mean, I've got some major concerns about it. I think there's the original premise of the calculations by the Scottish end is not good either. I mean, it presumes inflation in 2022 to be set at 4%. That's clearly a nonsense. I mean, the budget came out December the 8th, I think. We're into, you know, the start of February. And I mean, it's widely accepted already that it's 7% probably, and perhaps even more once all these energy costs arrive in April. So, you know, the premise of the budget, even at the Scottish end, is completely wrong. And there's big problems ahead because of that, because there can only be diminishing resources as the year goes on, thanks to inflation. The other thing that I thought was politically interesting was I read a press release from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, who obviously get a huge slice of their operating budget direct from the government, and they were complaining rightly that it was going to be much less, and also that the Scottish government had ended what had been previous policy in the previous years of giving figures for a number of years to let these organisations plan their budget over a number of years. That's been withdrawn now, and in this year's budget, it's only for the 1 year. But where it's politically interesting is, if you think back to the programmes we've had on in the last couple of weeks, we were revealing millions and millions of pounds going into new organisations that were promoting all the gender stuff. Now, that money's got to come from somewhere. And of course, it's going to come largely from the budget of funding external organisations. So a lot of the very valuable work that is done by the voluntary sector, they're losing that money to the gender organisations. And of course, the gender organisations are spending it on salaries. They're creating jobs for their pals, you know. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the other voluntary organisations don't have a problem with spending their money that way as well. But I mean, if you look at what happened to charities when it became known some of the salaries that people at the top of these charities were getting for themselves, donations went down and people stopped giving them money. I think there's a political risk here that some of these voluntary organisations who are seeing their funding squeezed are not going to be happy about money going to these new political organisations, because that's what they are, that are being set up and funded by the Scottish Government.
I'm going to come on to specifically on that later. But on the Phil, back on the budget, one of the things that Kate Forbes announced was that 73% of all Scottish households will be entitled to this £150 extra rebate towards cost of living crisis. The downside in that, Phil, is that energy bills alone, forget the 7% inflation, food prices and all that, just on energy, the average household in Scotland is going to be about £700 down. So there's a huge gap there. Now, for those people earning big salaries in Holyrood or Westminster, £400 or £500 is nothing. If you're a single parent with 3 kids at school, £500 is a lot of money.
It is, and it's a plaster on a gunshot wound. What can the hands are tied, as we discussed before, for the reasons we discussed before, and I admire, I like Kate Forbes. I think she's competent. I think she's clearly smart, talented. But the other thing that gets me is, why don't you mean Kate's background? I met her a couple of times, and she really is pretty good. But she's got BA in art history, and I think her master's was in diaspora and migration, which qualifies you as Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Economy. How exactly? I know Kate's had a couple of years' experience with Barclays, I think, doing some accounts, but a couple of years on doing accounts. And don't be wrong, a really sharp cookie and a sharp operator. why don't we put the right horses for courses? Why don't we put why don't we put economists in charge of the economy, teachers in charge of education, health professionals in charge of the health sector instead of administrators? Anyone in the health sector knows one of the biggest problems we've got in the health sector is having too many administrators and not enough nurses. So yeah, this kind of short fix, it's not fixing it to begin with. It's an attempt by the Scottish Government with the limited powers and funds that they have to redress some fundamental issues that we cannot address. No. It's impossible to fix this unless you take control of your own affairs and take control of your own country. And that's the biggest criticism we all have of the independence movement since 2014.
I don't want you laughing at me, but I've got a radical idea. I was thinking, don't laugh now, guys. They could go for independence. How's that for a radical idea?
Yeah, why not? Cunning plan.
Yeah, I know you're laughing at me, but hey, why not? Talking of that, and again, just without being cynical, I mean, for example, in justice, I take your point about putting the right people in, round pegs into round holes. Phil, if only we had a QC, a brilliant QC, you could have a great justice. Or how about a top surgeon as your health secretary? And
Yep.
Yeah, if only we had those people lying about somewhere that we could use. But what I've got to say, the usual suspects, Iain. Needless to say, the Tories and the Labour. Oh, it's a disaster. It's shocking, and yet they didn't put down a single amendment to the budget. But it's terrible. But Anwar Sarwar came out and he was saying how shocking it was and terrible. And then says, what we need to do, I'm going to make sure I read this so I don't make a mistake here. He wants a windfall tax on oil companies, a cut on VAT. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Iain. He's just made a case for independence because the Scottish Government, the greatest world, they can't do that. So what the hell is he talking about?
Well, he's playing politics. I mean, he knows that the Scottish Government don't have the powers for any of the things he's asking for. But I mean, this is the result of the devolution trap, and it's quite ironic that the leadership of the Scottish Government at the moment are all devolutionists, because fundamentalists have been warning them for years this was where we were going to end up sooner or later on the route they were going. It was only a matter of time. And I mean, every time the Scottish Government do something credible, something welcome, like, for instance, the child payment, as an example of an initiative they've taken, there's no corresponding revenue comes in through the block grant for that. So basically Westminster's packaged everything. I mean, even income tax, the receipts aren't as high as were forecast. So there's a gap beginning to appear there as well. And every time the Scottish Government do anything different from what's happening in England, then it's not getting funded through the block grant anymore, and it's having to come from this ever diminishing tax revenue that you're controlling yourself. And I mean, this is not something that should be surprising anybody. They were warned at the time that this was the route. Westminster are playing this very, very clever for Westminster, not for Scotland, But the trouble is, the people at the top of the Scottish Government are not negotiators. Phil's talked about this before, as I have. They're not negotiators. They haven't the ability to see down the road, And if you're negotiating with somebody and you can hold up an ice lolly and say, do you want it? And they grab it. Whereas what they should be saying is, no, that'll melt. I want a regular supply of that over a period of time, and we'll get a box of ice lollies every month for the next 25 years. But they don't negotiate that way. They grab the ice lolly, think that'll give us the money now to do something that'll be popular, but forgetting it's not sustainable because the following year the finance won't be there for it. And they've fallen into that trap time after time after time. And it's very depressing to look at. I mean, Ivan McKee, who we know he was a successful businessman. We know he was a good negotiator. What happened during the important negotiations over the power and the seabed and all the rest of it? He was removed from the team the one person you had in the team, the ability. Now I bet he probably, I don't know, but I bet he get removed because he was asking awkward questions. And Nicola would be getting awkward. She'd be getting nervous about it. Oh, we can't upset him, do you? Get him out, you know. We'll get somebody else to do it. But, I mean, they're making a real mess of running this country. A real mess.
Yeah, but you know, I want to keep in a couple of the positives. With the restriction, they managed to double the Scottish Child benefit to £20, which is great. I applaud that. I'm sure we all do. Public sector employees must be on a minimum a living wage of £10.50 an hour. Again, I applaud it. I'd rather see it 15, 20 quid. But you know, again, I go back to the fact their hands are tied, and I accept that. So those are great things. What I'm now struggling with is a couple of things. One is the workplace parking levy, which, although not in the budget this year, is coming into play next month, where you know they're going to have to. They're going to tax. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for those that aren't, if you're working your employer gives you a parking place, then you could be taxed on that. Now the employer's either got to pass it on to the employee, which is more than likely, and charge him, or the company's got to pay a levy and tax. And if they do that, which means, well, they'll come back, pay some staff off. You know what happens. It's always the guy at the bottom of the pile, the woman at the bottom of the pile, who gets squeezed. And if they've got to pay that, and on top of all these, the 7% inflation, the energy crisis, Phil, this is not this. If any time the SNP just said, no, we're shelving that just now, let's just push that aside.
This is all coming from the Greens.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yes.
Well, I'll be sticking the boot in there in a minute, Iain. Give me a moment.
I can't wait.
Yeah. All of these things that the Scottish government can do, I applaud, and I'm happy they're doing them. But it's the minutiae. It's the small issues that we're dealing with, and the problem really is it comes from a position where I agreed with Alex Salmon when he initially put the Scottish SNP and the Scottish government into prove yourselves worthy that we're capable of running this country mode. And that's what we did when we had the first SNP government. And it was excellent to see, because we proved beyond any doubt that we can do that. The problem is we've switched from that initiative just to prove we're capable, which was in Alex's strategy clearly just a small step on the way to independence, because independence was a priority. We're now in career mode. We're now full of people who see this as a long-term career. They're not using this as a step to independence. They're using it as a step in their own personal career, and what they see as a long-term career in the Scottish government, not really doing anything major. Look, what's the original ideas? See if you list up all the original ideas the SNP came out with when we started on this journey, and you're looking at the stuff we're coming out with now. Well, look at the people that we've got. We had serious people you had to contend with. Now we've got this mob from Stirling Uni who are mostly from the humanities, with no or little or no expertise in any of the difficult subjects, on any of the difficult issues that we have to deal with. And the excuse is, well, it's devolved, so we can't do anything about it. No, but you're supposed to be preparing for government. We should be in that. I know it's a bit of a joke with the Lib Dems, but this was a massive opportunity we had. We started out in the right path, and we've lost our way by staying on the short period of time when we're supposed to prove our worth and then move into independence. Why we're still there 7-10 years later? It's not acceptable. It's wrong. And we're, as you say, removing Ivan McKay. I didn't know that. I didn't know he was removed. He's one of the high spots in this cabinet, actually competent and capable, and an expert in the subject he's actually employed to be cabinet secretary.
That makes him dangerous.
Yeah, he's not malleable, because he's actually got an educated opinion.
He talks back with fact. You know, that's the problem. I mean, it's a glee club now. I mean, that effectively, that's what the Scottish government is. You're right. It's the humanities still in university glee club have taken over the country. You know, and I mean, it's outrageous. But there you go. And I mean,
Michelle Thompson's another one that's not been utilised properly.
Sorry?
Also talented.
Michelle Thompson is another very talented businesswoman.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, there is some good people there, but I mean, they are undoubtedly been kept down because the Glee Club don't want any challengers. You know, I mean, just take a look at the position of Joanna Cherry. I mean, the number of opportunities she would have had if she was the front bench spokesman in the last few months, and she's been able to do nothing because it's been handed to an interpretive dance instructor. I'm not even sure if she's promoted to an instructor. She's certainly a participant, you know. But I mean, it's just a joke. I mean, I looked the other week there because someone sent it to me, her voting record and speaking record in the House of Commons. And I mean, if they're ever looking for it to do a film again, a rerun of the Invisible Man, that wouldn't be allowed now. It'd be the Invisible Person. She would be definitely a candidate because she's done nothing since she took over from Joanna Cherry. And that's a great example of what we're talking about here, where ability, you know, and the ability to outstage the leadership has to be kept down and removed from the stage. And the only people that lose out in that is Scotland, you know. And I mean, they eventually, when this is all over, and it can't come soon enough for me, the reputation of the people at the top of the Scottish National Party at the moment will be in shreds, and they'll be looked on with enormous disdain as the blockage to Scottish independence when the opportunity was there.
Yeah. One other thing in the budget before we move on from that is the council tax freezes no more, and for the first time ever, it looks as if the Scottish Government are about to do a wee bit what Westminster does to the Scottish Government. They're pushing the onus onto the local authority, Phil, and saying you can raise it, you know, okay, there's a limit, I can't, is it 4% they're allowed to raise it, but they're putting the onus onto the local authority by saying if you need more money, well, go and tax your council taxpayers, because we've got no more money to give. Same as Westminster says to Holyrood.
Falling into a trap. That's falling straight into Westminster's trap, because we're being choked. Our Scottish Government is being choked for finance because of the way the system's set up and the Barnett formula and an ever-reducing budget overall fund that we have to apportion with increasing costs. And you're then in a position where councils, I mean, there is an argument, I suppose you could say, if it's a Tory council, they're likely to put it up. And that would perhaps increase the vote for those who oppose Tories and Labour government. But you're not protecting our people by this, because who's going to suffer again? It's those who are most vulnerable. And you look at, I'm seeing an increase. I'm still in Coatbridge, right? And I was out. I actually got a parking ticket today in a place where I've never had a parking ticket before, and I've noticed there's a good many more parking attendants wandering about Coatbridge these days. Why? It's a revenue source. It's an essential revenue source. And from what I hear, we've increased the numbers of parking attendants for that purpose, while a huge car park remains closed through lack of development in the centre of Coatbridge. People are forced to park in different places. And what does the council do? Fix the car park problem? No. Cash in on it by getting more car park attendants out there. So these are the things that these people, these councillors, are going to have to come up with. How are they going to fund public services? Because people underestimate the importance of the council. Absolutely critical in your services. Absolutely critical to how you live your life, your education, your healthcare, everything. Your schools, your bin collection, all of that kind of stuff, licensing, planning. These services are hugely they're under attack, they're under pressure, and we're falling into a trap by trying to play the game to make this balance, when the reality is the current system under Westminster and the policies that they impose upon us don't work. So you can patch it up a little bit. I'm with the Alex Salmon philosophy. You prove you're capable. We've done it. We did it for the first few years. Now go on with independence and stop wasting time and stop pandering to these individuals who want a career in politics. If you're in the SNP and you're going down
and lobbyists,
if your primary job is to get independence, not to get a career for yourself. There was a bunch who's lost a fortune getting into politics, and I'd do it again, and I'd lose money again. But you're doing it for the cause, not to line your own pockets.
Because that's the way it should be. Iain, one other thing, it's one of my, I'm going to go into my hobby horse. One of the things about Alex Salmon and the government of the SNP, the first 2 terms, was the radical nature of it. You know, doing things like doing away with bridge tolls and bringing in the free education and healthcare for the elderly, except all those things were radical and progressive and thinking out the box, which had been said before with the Lib Lab pacts, oh, it can't be done, can't be done. Now we need something radical. I think we all accept that local authorities are underfunded. The taxations in the UK in general is a mess. And you know, my big hobby horse, I believe in the land and roof tax, and I'm promoting that. I'm going to be pushing a motion at the upcoming conference on that one. It's definitely, we have to think radical, we have to think differently, and we have to find ways of funding our local authorities better than we do at present.
I agree totally. I mean, a radical move, you know, because I see annual ground rent, roofing, floor tax alongside coming in at the same time as we actually at long last start doing something about land reform. So I think they go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And, you know, people say, well, you know, it might be unfair and a lot of people own a lot of land. Well, you know, it isn't really, because at the end of the day, if you're developing that land, giving it a purpose, creating jobs, you're not paying more, you know, through this than you would be. It actually provides an incentive for landowners to use the land. It doesn't pay people to have big land banks where the land's tied up for years and years on end. That will disappear. And also it completely and utterly removes the possibility of tax avoidance, because you can't move, you know, you can't move half of Argyll and stick it in the Turks and Caicos Islands. So, I mean, we know who's going to own, we know who owns the land, every bit of land in Scotland's on a national register. If they don't pay the tax, then that land reverts back to the Scottish government. So, I mean, avoidance is not an issue any longer. And of course, once you get all these big bodies paying the proper rate of tax, that reduces the tax burden on everybody else.
Correct.
You know, so it's a much more equitable, justifiable system. And it's good news. And just before I finish in this, I remember well that first SNP government under Alex Salmon. And I enjoyed it so much. And one of the reasons I enjoyed it was, even when I was going out and I was talking to arch unionists, I could always win by saying that they're competent, aren't they? And even the most bitter unionists had to reluctantly admit, yeah, it's a very competent government. You know? And they're doing it on purpose, as George I can't make that argument anymore. And put the gender thing to one side. I can't make that argument on health. I can't make that argument on education. They are not competent. They are making mistakes all the time, and services are getting poorer. And that's a terrible tragedy, because that's why we nearly won in 2014. People believed, thanks to what the first SNP government had done, that the SNP were capable of running the country. They would be good, they would be competent. That argument's no longer out there in the same way as it was back in 2014. And that needs fixed before we go to any test. And it won't be fixed with the folk that are currently in charge.
Correct. And as you know, Iain, Estonia, you're one of your favourite places in the world. Estonia, New Zealand, Australia, Denmark, and a couple of states in America as well. It's a land tax they use as a form of raising revenue. And it's certainly something I'm going to be promoting, folks, and pushing forward. And watch this space for more on that. But over and above the budget, there's been other things happening. And, you know, we've got to go to, there was, Nicola Sturgeon today was talking about, she wants to see fit and proper test for footballers after what happened with Good Willie, the boy from Clyde to Raith Rovers. She wants, there should be shown that they're fit for purpose and fit and proper people to be footballers. I bet you Phil, she wouldn't be so keen to put that for people to be politicians in her party. To put that same test to them, it was kind of hypocritical of her talking about that, is it not?
It's an opportunist comment that I don't see as a practical solution to anything, because the law stands. There's the civil actions, and then there's the criminal law, the civil law of this country, and where there is adequate legislation to handle something, then you leave it to it. You don't layer it with more and more policy and small pieces of legislation designed to impose your interpretation of how the world should be. You let the law run its course. Now, if there's problems in the law itself, you can fix it. But the law is more than adequate to handle this. More than adequate to handle this. And it should be left alone. So, no, I think this is because of the criticism and the... I'm looking at Val McDermott, and she's saying, I'm not reinvesting until there are root and branch changes in this club. Now, what's Val McDermott know about running a football club? Fine, take your money out. Fine, if you don't want to support it, that's fine and good. But it's like who gives these people the right to think that they know best in any given scenario? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't stand up for injustice and where you think there's injustice, but you need to be practical about it. I'm not convinced that anything sensible, such as the situation that you would have for someone going to teach youth groups or a teacher, is appropriate in a football club. I mean, boys' clubs, different story. But a professional men's football club, I just don't see that that's tangible.
But it's all part of the cancel culture nowadays that goes on. But another one, Iain, what the Nicola surgeon came out with, she was berating Boris Johnson for smearing an opponent.
Yeah, I saw that.
It took me about 10 minutes to close my jaw when I heard that one. And she was saying how bad it was and terrible and wrong, and we should try and lift the level of things. And I wonder if Alex Salmon was watching that going, pardon, could you play that one? Play it again, Sam? It was quite
she has this unique ability to shut off anything she's ever done. She's saintly throughout, no matter what happens. And she feels she can comment on anything. But the hypocrisy machine burst when she said that, because she'd spent the previous few years deliberately and intentionally and very unfairly smearing someone who had done her no harm whatsoever, indeed who was responsible to a large extent for her success in politics. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is where politicians just lose it completely. A politician's got nothing to do, or should have nothing to do with the running of a football club. And setting down political diktats about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in an organisation like a football club. The people that control football clubs are the boards. If the boards don't behave themselves, then the supporters take over. And you saw that when FIFA, when they tried to set up the European leagues and the boards went a step too far, they got too greedy, and the fans revolted. That's the way you change things in football clubs. You don't change them with the First Minister deciding, she's going to dictate what should happen. I mean, are we going to be asking football players to play with rainbow badges on like they tried to do with the nurses? I mean,
do not give them any ideas, Iain.
I'm just saying, it's out of control, all this thinking. And this is just populist. It's not populist anymore. It may have been populist at the start, but once people find out what they're actually trying to do, it's anything but populist. It's quite the reverse. And that's the stage we're at now in Scotland. And there's going to be kickback in a lot of what the Scottish government have been doing in recent times, because more and more people are taking an interest, and families are talking to families. And, I think there'll be a reaction against it very soon.
Well, on that, Phil, the EHRC are under attack at the moment from, again, the usual suspects, including Patrick Harvey, because they're saying under the law, there's the GRA reform is not complying with the law and the existing laws. And they've said that there's no actual need for GA reform. But Patrick Harvey has said, now this is in response to Baroness Falconer, who in the EHRC. He says if they try to clarify the law, they will be strongly opposed by Scotland. Well, I'm sorry, Patrick. You're saying that you will oppose something that's lawful and legal because you don't like it and that Scotland's with you. And yet all the polls, Phil, show that 70-80% of Scotland is opposed to this GRA reform as presently penned. Just because he's a cabinet minister and he's actually still in a job where he's saying he's going to go against the law. That's not right.
Foolish. That's really foolish. They need to approach this differently, but I think it shows the desperation now. The penny is beginning to drop. Too many people, when they understand what GRA means and the self-identification and what's been going on, they're quite right to be. We should be allowed to criticise these things. You know, if somebody comes out with constructive criticism, no matter how passionately you believe in it, we're paying these politicians to listen, to listen to the balance of what the majority of the people want and implement what they were voted in to implement. And it wasn't self-ID. You know, they're gone too far here. They've just gone too far. They've been pulled up about it and they're not happy. And they need to listen, or we'll do something about it. Simple as that.
Iain, we're about to nationalise the railways, which I think is a great thing. I would nationalise much more. You know, I would nationalise the power companies, gas, water. Well, the water is already in public hands. But, you know, I mean, you know me, I'm an old lefty. But one of the things they're talking about doing, once they do it, Nicola's talking about, they are going to ensure there'll be women-only carriages on the trains. Now, this brings us on the topic we're talking about, Iain. It's Friday night. You and I are out and with Phil having a few swallies. We get to the train. We're going back to yours in Paisley. The only carriage that's got seats is the women's carriage. So, tell you what, guys, I'm a woman. And the ticket collector says, well, you're not a woman, you've got a beard and, you know, you're a man. I'm getting him jailed and we're all on the women's carriage. It's a nonsense. It's just again another nonsense.
It's a recipe, a recipe for trouble. But, I mean, I don't think many women demand that they have women-only carriages. I mean, there'll be some, I don't doubt, but I would think very few would do it. And then, of course, the problem then comes if you set up women-only carriages, men will want men-only carriages. And then what happens to the women that's trying to go in the men-only one? I mean, public transport should be public transport and it should be run properly. And, you know, I would think you would be more at risk in a women-only carriage at night.
If you're a predator, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Exactly.
You would be in a mixed-sex carriage going home where men would often stand up to protect a woman from, you know, troublemakers and all that. It's a recipe. But again, this is the Glee Club again. This has probably been brought up at the Glee Club. And Nicola says, oh, I'll sort that out. Yeah, no problem. Leave it with me. I'll have that organised. Right, nationalise the railways, women-only carriages, you know. They'll have an LGBT carriage before you know it, by the way.
Nah, it's nonsense, and I'm completely in this. This was tried and are discussed in Australia as well, but the same group and the exact same reasons were put out. If you're a predator, that's just got a big target.
That's the first carriage to go to.
That's the first target. And who keeps the predators at bay? It's men predominantly that will do the defending.
Yeah,
and you know, I would encourage my daughters and my wife to learn how to handle themselves. But men are physically stronger, and that's traditionally been a role, and one that we fathers and brothers and continue to carry out. So I know it was well intentioned. Let's think about it. It was well intentioned to try and protect women in public transport, and that I'm all for that. Nationalising railways, great idea, long overdue. We're the only country in Europe that currently doesn't, pretty much. So let's get back onto that. I'm happy with that. But it's not just, it's got to be the operator. It's got to be the full show we've got to run. But this is a foolish notion, and it will fail. It shouldn't even get a start. It really shouldn't be implemented.
One last thing on it, you know, on this particular topic, we talked about it just before we come on air, was the couple of nurses. It was mentioned in the House of Lords, I believe, or the House of Commons. I'm not sure which one of the two. Got to finally confirm it all up. were sacked for expressing concerns about trans women being in single-sex wards. And because they mentioned it, they were sacked. It was brought up by a Labour baroness today in the House of Lords. The world's gone crazy, Iain.
Yeah, that's just ridiculous. I mean, the obvious point to make is if you're in hospital, you're in a weakened, vulnerable state. You know, it's also stressful because you're outside your normal home environment. To add to that, they're letting some guy that's self-ID'd sleep in the bed next to you, at night. I mean, I read Eva Comrie wrote something about this. You know, she's lost a limb. You know, she said if she was ever in a mixed sex ward, she'd keep the limb next to her so she could take the head off the guy who came to attack her. You know, so I mean, you have to have policemen in the ward to defend them from a pack of women if they try. But I mean, it's just nonsense. And I mean, this has got completely and utterly out of control. I mean, we're now talking about the most ludicrous situations. I mean, I'm watching the Winter Olympics over here, you know, and there's loads of sports. You look at the men's downhill and the women's downhill, and you look at the difference in times, you know, and they're very substantial. You know, so a guy that's absolutely nowhere in the men's downhill would be a medal contender in the women's. And that's just to do, as Phil said, it's to do with biology. It's to do with a male being, you know, stronger, all the rest.
Testosterone.
Yeah, you know, so, I mean, at the end of the day, we can't go down this road. You know, otherwise there's no point in having the Winter Olympics. You know, it should be, it'll become the battle of the chemists. You know,
we should stop all women's sport. There's no point in it.
Absolutely, it'll become public sport, and Andy and everybody can have a go. You know, but women will win nothing. I mean, it's just stupidity. And I mean,
but it's not only just the winning of medals or sport. You know, I mean, I saw a documentary a while back.
You know, Roddy, what frightens me about this isn't a lunatic fringe that have no powers, you know, on this matter. This is governments. This is people that are in government with extensive powers that are promoting this. And that's what makes it really dangerous.
I think they are lunatics. But they are, absolutely they are. But the other thing, that documentary I saw about one of the problems on a health issue is that getting young girls, particularly those that are just, you know, coming into puberty and coming to their time, is getting them to exercise and do different sports. It's difficult as it is today. But if there's boys going to be, that's going to put them off even more. So it's something we've got to control it. But it's not the only thing that's going on. I mean, this week, and I've got to say, Paisley educated Liz Truss went to Moscow, and we all held our breath. I didn't think this show would go ahead this week. I was convinced it would all be nuked by the time Liz had left Moscow. She humiliated herself, embarrassed the nation, and gave the Russians lots to laugh at. Iain, now, as you're a Paisley buddy, and she was educated in Paisley, I think you've got to take some responsibility here.
Absolutely none. You know, and we're not responsible for Andrew Neil either. I'll just get that in early doors. And she may have turned up. I didn't know her when she lived in Paisley. She did go to school in Paisley then. I hope she didn't infect the rest of the class. But I mean, I watched the performance, and I mean, the Russian foreign minister, you know, he had a good chuckle at Liz Truss. If Liz Truss thinks that Britain's still got any major diplomatic threat and her 1,000 soldiers, you know, it was somehow going to intimidate the Russians.
I'm honestly disappointed that what we have is a conversation between a dumb and a deaf person. It seems like we listen but don't hear. At least our most detailed explanations fell on unprepared soil. They say Russia is waiting until the ground freezes like a stone so its tanks can easily cross into Ukrainian territory. I think the ground was like that today with our British colleagues, from which numerous facts that we produced bounced off.
First of all, I certainly wasn't mute in our discussions.
We did expect that it will be a certain brilliance of British diplomacy, which we did not discover at all, because UK minister was speaking with and operating with a limited number of slogans and formulations. And it was nothing like a dialogue based on mutual respect, recognition of mutual interests and search of solutions. We did not see any contribution. She was repeating just formulations and slogans that she is doing it here in the parliament, by Twitter, in the newspapers, nothing else.
Were you expecting a detailed conversation about Ukraine, Minsk agreements, future security in Europe? Is that what you're saying?
It was a detailed explanation from the Russian side by Minister Lavrov, what is happening, what is our desire, while this is the situation, but the British side neither listened and nor heard what we were saying.
If you could go back in time, would you recommend the visit not to happen? Do you think in a sense it's been counterproductive?
I cannot be so non-diplomatic. Yes, recommend. We stand always for the dialogue and for the conversation, because it's the only way of diplomacy. But ultimatums, strong words, threats, it's a path to nowhere. Absolutely, it's an impasse. So, but more and more, unfortunately, in this country, in the US, they are using this type of diplomacy.
So, I'm by no means pro-Russian. In fact, I'm probably very much the reverse. But this situation in Ukraine is pretty silly. I mean, the Ukrainian government don't think they're about to get invaded, you know, and they've said so publicly in as many forms as they possibly can, you know. Liz Truss telling the Russians, who have got 100,000 troops on exercises close to the border, that they shouldn't be allowed to do that. What? There's not a single Russian soldier in the Ukraine. Their exercises are been carried out in Russia, you know.
Belarus.
So, and Belarus, at the invitation of the Belarus government. It's joint exercises with their forces. So, I mean, we've got or the UK, or indeed NATO, has got no right to tell the Russians to stop exercising their troops on their own land. It's when they come over out of their own land. And let's face it, there's not going to be a surprise attack in Ukraine. I mean, the propaganda has been going for months and months on end. And I'll just give you one. I mean, NATO's obviously all bases all round Russia, you know, so you can understand their concern. But I'm surprised Putin's, you know, even following this policy, because earlier on, about a decade ago, they launched a massive cyber attack on Estonia, the Russians. And the Estonians are pretty good, in fact, the best probably in the world at, you know, the internet and computers. And they fought it off. And what was the result? Well, the result was NATO sat down and thought, we really need to have a cyber security headquarters. Where will we put it? Oh, we'll put it in Tallinn in Estonia. You know, so Putin's attempt to bully the Estonians ended up with him getting the NATO Cyber Defence Centre built, you know, less than 100 miles from his border. So, I mean, it didn't work. And that's the problem. I mean, Putin holds a lot of cards here, because I don't believe Germany is going to be terribly keen to go along with all this, because they require so much gas, you know, from Russia. France also imports gas, you know. So I think, you know, this is saber-rattling. This is the arms industry wanting to keep sales going. And that's the problem. You know, they need a threat of war or a war to keep the cash registers rolling. And that's what's going on here. This is a NATO arms industry wanting to create custom for the next 10 years.
There was one embarrassingly funny moment, Phil, where Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said to Liz Truss that was she aware of Rostov and, I don't know how to pronounce it, Voronezh regions. And she quickly chipped in and said, yes, and the Great Britain will never recognise the sovereignty of Russia over those two regions, whereupon the UK ambassador leaned over to Liz Truss, who went to Foreign Secretary. They've been Russian for about 1,000 years. And last week she was talking about our friends in the Baltic Sea, and I mean, she doesn't even have a geography level.
No,
I mean, the woman's
geography's not a strongest point.
She gets her geography information from Rab.
Dominic Raab, Dover. Who'd have thunk
it? Eventually discovered that Dover was a port.
No, it's not. But listen, she's an intelligent woman, but she's really not a competent cabinet secretary. I mean, her academic career is quite an impressive one. So she's nobody's fool in that respect, but she's making a fool of herself there. I mean, there's a classic line from a Sting song: "What might save us, me and you, is that Russia love their children too." This is saber rattling. There's not going to be a war. This is a game, and the 1,000 soldiers just makes me just. Anybody who, as I say, has a casual glance on history, 20th century history, Operation Barbarossa, the last people to invade Russia, the Germans, 3.8 million men, 600,000 motorized vehicle on a 2,900 kilometer long front. And the Russians are supposed to be quaking in their boots because we've put 1,000 soldiers on standby. I mean, people need to wake up to the lies that are being told here. This is nonsense. And I go back to as we discussed even last week, because this is contentious. Dmitry Peskov, who was the spokesman for Putin in the 2013, I think G20, he's the one that came out and said Britain's a small island that nobody listens to anymore. And we sent a couple of our Scottish MPs over to discuss politics and international diplomacy with the Russians, with the Ukrainians. It's nonsense. We are making a fool of ourselves, and it's only the radical right, the great Rule Britannia brigade that actually believe this nonsense. And we need to put facts up and point out that it's exactly what Iain says. This is about money. It's about oil and gas, particularly gas feeding into Europe. The Americans, and they don't want the Russians to continue to cash in on it. There's various different pipelines, like the TAP pipelines through Thessalonica and Albania and to Italy, that are preferred to anything coming out of Russia. And this is about money. That's what it comes down to every time, whether it be the arms race or oil and gas, and we're being taken for fools. And even the quickest, a quick Google search will expose the complete nonsense it is to put 1,000 troops into the field. And that's another thing. Iain's right. Nobody wants boots on the ground. That's why we don't do Syria and we stopped fighting people in the Middle East anymore. It's proxy wars. Yeah. It's proxy wars that the West use. The 2,000 bases that America, I think there's 800 official full-size bases, but they've got 2,000 smaller bases.
And Russia's got one. Russia's got one base outside Russia, which is in Syria. But the Americans have got 800. But Russia's got.
But I mean, I'll tell you quite a funny story quickly here. In the early to mid 80s, I was a guest of the Christian Democrat Union in West Germany through the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I went across, and I was part of the time in Goslar, and then I got moved to Berlin. And one of the meetings I had in Berlin was with the British Army commander, and he sat in the room and he had a map up, and it had, the American sector and a couple of flags of where American forces were, the French sector, and then the British sector. And then all around it was surrounded, all these flags of the East German regiments and the Russian regiments surrounding it, And I said to him, I'm looking at that map, you're a bit exposed here, and you know it. He said, oh, we are, he said. So I said, what happens if the balloon goes up? He says, well, we do train for that. I said, oh, what do you do? He says, we test how fast we can get into civilian clothes. And mix with the Berlin population. And we've all got sabotage targets. But that's it. If you're sitting at home expecting a big battle to take place here, it ain't going to happen, because the numbers just don't stack up. So he wouldn't have been particularly impressed with the Liz Truss, suggestion of great strength in the circumstance. So, I mean, both sides tell lies. I mean, I grew up listening to the Warsaw Pact countries. There were these huge forces that were arrayed against the West. Then, come 1991, the East opened up, and I worked quite extensively in several of these Eastern European countries. And, I've got friends that were in the Soviet army, and I mean, they tell me quite openly, if a war had ever started, their main mission was to find out how quickly they could swap sides. That was their plan, to immediately, move from being a Warsaw Pact country to joining the West. So it must be really galling to Putin to look and see Estonia as a full member of the NATO, yeah, but also the UN Security Council. Estonia got voted on. We country, 1.4 million, and they're sitting with a full vote, the same vote as Britain's got on the UN Security Council.
So Boris went there, Phil, and he was talking about no small country should be bullied by a bigger country.
Poland and the UK won't accept a world in which a powerful neighbour can bully or attack their neighbours. And we won't accept it because we believe all people, no matter where they are born, have a right to live safely and choose who governs them and to decide what organisations they aspire to have membership of, or indeed what bodies they want to cease being members of. And we will not compromise on that principle.
And they should not be getting a government that they don't want. If they don't want a certain government, they should be allowed to decide. And then there was a bit down the bottom, it said, except for viewers in Scotland, Wales and the 6 occupied counties of Northern Ireland. Again, we were talking about Nicola's hypocrisy. I mean, the hypocrisy of him is just, I mean, how dare you? How much of this was done to deflect from his problems at home?
It's also to pander to the lobbyists. I mean, the MPs are most vulnerable when they're under attack, and that's when they give concessions to those who will save their skins. And this is what's happening here. It's the same. I mean, Boris has got a job to do, as we discussed last week. We know his job is to not just do Brexit, but to see it through and carry the can for all of the fallout that's inevitable. And we haven't even seen all of it yet. It's still coming down the pipe. But he's vulnerable and he's doing what he's told. And it doesn't make any sense. It's obvious lies, but that comes natural to Boris. The guy's just a waste of time. He really is.
Yeah. But he's lost one of his defence mechanisms. Eventually, at last, Cressida Dick, how well named, eventually resigned. But we've got to say it was pressure from Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, that finally made her leave. It's long overdue that I mean, how she ever got the job in the first place after what happened with Jean de Menzies, the Brazilian lad that was shot under her in her watch. But she should have gone long ago. But will a new commissioner make any difference? Is the Met too far gone? Is it beyond help?
I must admit, I don't like situations where, the police and the politicians are so close. I prefer to see justice, the whole justice system, clearly divorced from politics.
Yep.
Because I think that's a recipe for trouble. And I mean, we'll just have to see how this all turns out. But it's quite interesting. Our parting shot was that the police at Downing Street, it wasn't their responsibility to do a check about parties and all the rest of it. So you wonder what they do protect Downing Street from. But I mean, as long as you got to carry out, you're in with the sound of things,
But on your point, saying about the police being too close to the government and the judiciary being too close to the government, Scotland's worse than England for that. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
As we've seen with Alex Salmon, we've seen with Craig Murray, and we've seen with Mark Hurst and others who are still to get their moment in court. But we're nearly finished, lads. We've nearly done our hour, would you believe? And one last thing I want to talk about was this week, Tommy Shepherd put out, it was the same as the tweet he put out in 2020 or 2019 rather, that he was going for a big strategy meeting on independence, how they were going to move the thing forward and get things going, Phil. But he put out virtually, someone put it up on Twitter, virtually the same tweet he put out in 2019, just before the general election of December 2019. And now here we are, a couple of months out for an election.
Yeah.
And suddenly the SNP are all, I'm having a dig at you here yet, are getting all excited about independence for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you'd think there was an election coming up. Oh, was there an election coming up? And that's the problem. And I like Tommy. Tommy's a talented guy, very intelligent, very capable, who was also, in my belief, not being properly utilised by the SNP. But yeah, we'll all be doing it. It's the balance between loyalty and telling the truth. But this came around, I remember that came around, and it was around about the time when Scottish oil was under pressure. And, you know, the Tories, for example, didn't say there's 100,000 Scottish jobs at risk just now in oil and gas. And this is the kind of stuff you pump out to try to get people to vote for you. But, you know, we should be focusing on the stuff that really is at risk, like oil and gas jobs. I mean, I saw the figures. It was like 2015, there was about 375,000 jobs in the UK that relied on oil and gas. And the year before, that's a drop from 440,000 jobs. And Scotland, with 96.5% of the oil, has got less than half of the jobs. I mean, I worked in two major BP projects, Clare Ridge, and we were down at, Clare Ridge was at Old Street, AMEC, you know, on the Clerkenwell Road, 650 people. All on big whack, on a Scottish West of Shetland project, all paid out of London, all live mostly non-Scots, and then you'd Quad 204 Leatherhead KBR, 600 people on that, and these are jobs in Scotland, projects in Scotland that are harvesting Scottish oil and gas,
Would
and
never
it's all
happen in
going
Norway.
down south.
It would never happen in Norway.
But never, exactly, because they're self-determined. So instead of playing these silly games, Tommy, you should be focusing on. Look, I don't want to be overcritical because Tommy's a good guy. He's one of the good guys, in my opinion. And he's got to say, you know, look, this time we're going to do it. But it's time people like the genuine folk in SNP stood up and says enough's enough. Let's stop this nonsense and actually do it this time. Let's cut all this garbage out, all these stupid dead ends we've been wandering down, and focus on the point, which is our prime directive: independence.
Well, I mean,
independence, nothing less.
The other thing, Phil, is, you know, we let people off with this. You know, if you look at what Iain Wood said in 2014, the future of oil and gas in Scotland.
Vichy.
And you look at what he's saying now.
Turncoat.
Absolutely the other thing. Now, why do we tolerate that? Why don't we have MPs at Westminster, MSPs at Holyrood, who are making his life a misery every single day, quoting what he said, saying you were a liar. Why should we trust you? I mean, you know, we should be doing that all the time with all the folks in South Scotland.
They are doing it. The reason you don't understand it is it's because he's been criticised through the theme of interpretive dance.
Well, my dancing skills certainly let me down.
But here's the other thing, Iain. He's not actually. He's not. He used to be a fish supply man and switched it to oil. He's not even an oil man. He's not a geologist. He's not an expert on oil. He delivers the newspapers and the milk to the rigs. Let's get it clear. He's not a geologist. But his word was taken, and he was put up as an expert, and he's a liar, and he's a member of the Vichy.
That's exactly it. But I mean, why don't we say it? We say it in this programme.
We just
but why does the
because he'll sue you.
Not say it? Why don't all these people and all these big salaries, why aren't they saying it? Because
they're on big salaries.
People in Scotland.
Hands up, because we're on big salaries, Iain, is the answer to that.
If you want to convince people in Scotland to vote yes, you've got to expose the folk that lied to get them to vote no. It's a simple thing. It's not rocket science. But it takes some bravery. It takes the fact that you'll get flack, you know, from the media, the unionist media, trying to protect them. But that wouldn't stop me, and it shouldn't stop them.
No, it certainly wouldn't stop me, and it wouldn't stop this programme. Gentlemen, I've got to stop you there, though, because our hour is, we've actually overrun it. Well, Techie's going to have to do a wee bit. But keep in the bit about Paisley. Make sure the viewers know.
That was below the belt.
It was.
She's nobody of mine.
Anyway, gentlemen, as always, thank you. And keep yourself safe till I've got you next week. And to you, my viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have with my two good buddies here. And until I speak to you again, please take care.
Just remember, Paisley subsidises Barhead. You're living off our wealth.
Greens, 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 greens. When I force through GRE to pander to the TREs, I'll need some support, but I know I can bribe the Greens, 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 greens. When I backstab out of spite and trample over women's rights, I'll need to call on some wee misogynistic Greens. I can pay the price, organise a nice cabinet post for you. Only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm making the yes voters spew. When I get caught out telling lies, I'll need unquestioning our eyes, and who can I turn to? Sleek at power hungry Greens. Greens, 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 greens. I can pay the price, organise a nice cabinet post for you. Only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm making the yes voters spew. I've sold out to the union now. I'm just a treacherous wee cow, but I know I'm alright. I can just buy off the Greens. Greens, 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 greens. Greens, 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 greens. Greens, 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 greens.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.